local market insights, global market intel, and expert opinion. A perfect cocktail with the condiments that your business needs, the condiments of success that your business needs as you cook your strategy with your own unique business recipe. And this is where we intend to give you all of that, a plethora of all of those condiments on a nice platter of knowledge and discussion and dialogue. Welcome to your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. This is Bisnomics. The Sri Lankan economy, one aspect of our country which any citizen, any business owner, any business decision maker, and entrepreneur needs to pay careful attention to. What is the status of the Sri Lankan economy? We all know the challenges that we are facing, but what is the background story to all that? What have we missed? And most importantly, moving forward, what do we need to do so that we do not repeat the same mistakes that we have done over the last half a century or so? This will be our focus today on Bisnomics. And joining me for this discussion is an economic analyst and author of a very famous and popular economic book and publication, Mr. Waruna Singapuli. Waruna, welcome to Bisnomics.
Thank you, Tarindu.
So, let's take a look at our economy, Waruna. We are looking at an economy in the size of somewhere around $90 billion. We are a land that has an abundance of potential, geography-wise and resources-wise. Yet we see that so many other countries with lesser economic resources, lesser, I would say, manpower, or lesser geographic potential doing far better than us. Clearly something is wrong. But my initial focus is coming out of the pandemic, how strong are the core fundamentals of the Lankan economy? Let's start with that today.
Yeah. So this pandemic is once in a generation kind of event. So it has been a big challenge for all the countries, leaving alone Sri Lanka. So it's even more challenging for developing countries who has probably lesser financial resources. So in that front, we have to acknowledge that all countries are struggling. But as you said, coming into the pandemic, Sri Lanka had its own set of problems.
Our problems began way before the pandemic.
Way before. So to start with, we have a low economic growth of around 3-4% over the last so many years. And we are, in my view, in a lower middle income trap, which is explained by this low growth that we've been experiencing over the last few years. So on top of that...
So when you say lower income trap, that means middle income trap, that means we are unable to really break into the higher levels.
Correct. So we are sort of struggling at $4,000 level for so many years now. And on top of that, since 1978, we've been maintaining a huge external current account deficit, which means every year we buy a lot of goods and services from the rest of the world, a lot more than we sell to the rest of the world. So that's why you call that we have a deficit in the external current account. So this deficit, predominantly, we've been financing through borrowings. So that's why we have a scenario over the last 40 years. The foreign debt has been growing at a phenomenal rate, and especially over the last 10 years, it has really grown. So with the fact that we are in a low economic growth scenario, it's even more difficult to roll over going forward. If we had high growth, still it's possible to roll over this debt. But now that we are come to a sort of a trap in terms of growth, it's even more challenging to continue to roll over this debt. So that is a structural issue that we have built up over a period of decades.
What you're saying, in the architecture of our economy itself, that problem is there.
That problem is there. So on the other hand, what we see is now in this scenario, at least one positive thing that I see is that we have a stable government and a president from the same party, and not just a government, we have a 2/3 government. So if we are to address these structural issues, we have the perfect setup to do that. Another problem that I would say is over the last 40 years, what we have tried to do is to address these problems at a bottom-up approach. See, even today, what we hear is a lot of problems with every sector, with every economic class or social class. We hear these problems and we try to solve those problems at those levels. But the problem is, if you are to accumulate all these problems and try to find solutions, we simply do not have resources. So that approach will not make a lot of success. What we need is a top-down approach where we have a big strategy. If implemented properly, those benefits will trickle down to all segments and some of those problems will get solved automatically. So that approach we have never seen over the last 40, 50 years. So that I would say are the problems and also some of the positive factors which we can look up to over the next few years to rectify some of these problems.
I think, as you very correctly said, the political instability factor can now be removed because now we have a very political wise, it's very stable. As you said, the president and the government is from the same side. But at the same time, Mr. Singapore, I also want to question you now. We see some political forces, especially at a trade union level, that were instrumental in bringing the president into power. Now we see over certain economic issues, economically important issues like, for example, the Eastern Container Terminal. We see that some of those unions are actually now getting into more of a loggerhead situation with the current authorities and the ruling parties and even the president. They are openly challenging the president. So don't you think that a bit of the negative aspects of political uncertainty is also now factoring into the situation?
Well, these challenges are always there in a democracy. See, if you take an authoritarian rule like some of the other countries, then you don't have to worry too much about these things. But
these one-party systems, etc.
Yeah, but in a democracy, these are always challenges. So one might even question the rationale of a democracy also to that extent. Because
and people are questioning this now.
Yes. So those things have to be addressed. Obviously, those things have to be addressed. But like I said at the beginning also, the key thing is to have a clear plan. And
Correct.
when you start in office, you should be, you can spend maximum 1 year to brush up whatever the planning and then start implementing. So when you delay, unfortunately this pandemic happened, which was a thing that all the countries had to face.
Correct.
So that is a bit of an unfortunate incident. But still, now going forward, they have to find solutions and quickly start implementing under the scenario.
As you very correctly said, I believe a lot of even foreign investors have a positive outlook whenever a country has a stable government, because politics and economics go hand in hand. You can't expect to have good economic growth without having proper political power or even a proper stable politically appointed government, democratically appointed government. And we saw recently some of the top investors globally, like the Rothschild family, coming and being very positive regarding the country and saying, look, we are happy to see that this growth is happening. So as you said, it's a mixture of good and bad news that is coming towards the Sri Lankan economy amidst the pandemic, and I really like those relevant thoughts you shared up front. Let's talk about some of the key turning points, because even in your book, you have very clearly identified so many instances, Mr. Singapore, that we actually have missed out. What are the key turning points in the Sri Lankan economy over the last half a century or 50 years that we missed out from a global economy perspective?
Yeah, I think the single biggest factor that I've tried to mention here is that we failed in our foreign policy. See, we have probably not been shrewd enough or practical enough to exploit it. Say, for instance, the one big thing that we really want is to get access to markets. See, we have failed. See, if you take the last few decades, all the countries that developed was through technological developments.
For sure.
So Sri Lanka is hardly there in the technology sphere. Apart from individual brilliance here and there, Sri Lanka is largely out of it. So one big factor...
We are not a first choice destination, and that's
Correct.
a major problem.
Correct. So what I see this as someone getting the first job. See, when you try to get the first job, all the employers look people with prior experience. So if you do not have the prior experience as the first job, it's not easy. Unless you are brilliant, it's very difficult to get the first job. So that's why you need a sponsor. Somebody who will take the risk and say, okay, I'll give you a chance and give you the job. So that's the sponsor that we need. That's what I mean by the foreign policy, to exploit foreign policy to get access to markets. Say like country A coming and telling, okay, we will buy $1 billion worth of electronics or $1 billion worth of semiconductors from you. And that is a big statement. That is a big break for Sri Lanka. Then you see a lot of investors getting...
The other heads also begin to turn.
Yes, investors start noticing Sri Lanka. See, sometimes we question why are we not getting investments, why are we not getting FDIs, and all the investments that we get are for either leisure or real estate or for rubber or tea or the same traditional stuff.
And most of the time, more than investment, it's like loans.
Correct. So the real reason is we do not have those key factors, say a ready market, a ready buyer. Then that gives us that initial push to come up with these investments and to really access those markets. So there's no free lunch in the economy, whether it's global economy or the local economy. There's no free lunch. So,
Milton Friedman.
yeah. So for somebody to agree to buying things from us, we might have to give something in return.
Correct.
So that's why I said we have to be practical with some of these things and be open to those things. I mean, without sacrificing our sovereignty or security, we can still do it. And that's what a lot of countries have done in the past as well. So I think that's one big factor that we have missed out over the last so many decades, at least to get to the negotiation table with these powers, with knowing what we need. Without knowing what we need, going to the negotiation table doesn't mean anything, because they come and tell us what they want.
Correct.
And in the end we might agree to give those by getting in return what we do not need. So that has been the story of Sri Lanka as well. So that's something we have to avoid going forward. We have to be more prudent and practical in addressing that.
Mr. Singapuli, now I think your very valid thoughts are much appreciated here, because as you very correctly said, we see some countries like, for example, South Korea, the Republic of South Korea,
Sure.
how they've very much aligned with some of the nations like, for example, the US, and got the preferred trading nation status.
Sure.
And as a
Sure.
result, they've got lots of work coming into their shores.
Sure.
And
Sure.
one thing that I've noticed in Sri Lanka, I don't know whether you'll agree with me on this one, but as the governments change, we've seen quite a big pendulum swing, an extreme swing from pro-West to, for example, pro-China, and again back to pro-West, back to pro-China. And we see some successful economies in the Asian region like Singapore maintaining a very moderate relationship with all nations, and that gives them a very strong, I would say, journey to their economy. And as you very correctly mentioned, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You need patience. And I read in your book about how Singapore had the Jurong East terminals built in the 1960s, but for almost 6-7 years there was no one coming in. Then here comes Texas Instruments, and as a result so many investments come in. And we all know the famous words of Dr. Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia, who said, "Come, use my land and give jobs to my people," which inspired and which sort of propelled the economy forward. So as you very correctly mentioned, we need a proper long-term foreign policy with a economic outlook as well, isn't it?
Sure. So like I said, I mean, we don't have to really align with one party. We just need to know what to ask from each party, whether it's China or US. We need to be very clear what we want from them. If we don't know that, then there is a problem. So that's why I wouldn't say we need to align with any party, but always know the key thing is to access the markets. That's one key thing that whoever gives us, whether it's US, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whoever is willing to buy things from us, or goods or services from us, then we have to really be receptive to them and work towards it. And luckily Sri Lanka is in a great place where we have chips to bargain with. You know, there are many things that, you know, whether it's US or China likes in us. So there are things that we can pay them with. Say if we are in a situation where nobody is looking at us, we are in a very weak position, because there's no way that we can ask for sponsorship, because there's nothing for us to give. But we are in a position, or at least in a strategic location, where there are things that we can offer, which is a great asset, which again I feel is something that we have not utilized.
Understood. And let's talk about the rectifying of the past mistakes. Now, if you look at the electronic sector, now today in a digital world, electronics play a very crucial role.
Sure.
And we all know the electronic development, or the construction of electronic components. These work started to trickle into the Asian region somewhere around the 1970s and 80s.
Sure.
And very unfortunately, we experienced the start of a civil war back in the 1980s.
Sure.
And I believe this discouraged a lot of companies from starting such investments in Sri Lanka.
Sure.
What is your thought on this? Because the way I see it, one of the biggest economic opportunities missed for us maybe in the century has been the inability to have electronic and electronic device related component manufacturing industry taking place in Sri Lanka. Do you agree with me on this one?
Yeah, so even now I think there's a thinking where they are looking for import substitution, and in the process they have gone for some of the restrictions with imports as well. So it's like this, the way I see it. On one side, sudden import restriction is something that I may not agree with. I know some people are saying actually this what happened, it's good, now we can stop the imports and so on, but I don't think any change can happen abruptly. You know, if a sudden
no overnight success.
Yeah, no overnight success, because it's a shock, because even the little town in the shop depends on imports. So
Correct.
suddenly if it's not there, they are struggling. So you can't have many people in the economy struggling. So if at all, whatever changes should be gradual, let's say at least over a period of 5 years. So that change has to happen. So import restriction per se is not an answer. In terms of import substitutes also, I think it's partially correct. You know, you close to a certain extent and allow local producers to come up. But a critical point, I would say, rather than just import substitution, it should be a drive to get some of these players into Sri Lanka as well through negotiation. And in the process, the import substitution of the local producers will also get a catalyst, because otherwise, if you don't do that, what might happen is there will be few local producers who will be making normal profits at the expense of the consumer, and the industry will also may not come up to a global standard level, because the idea is because see, no point in you reinventing the wheel. If the technology is there, you can't be spending time to do it in house, because it's already there. You have to take it quickly. Technology is moving so fast, and then there's another angle to this as well in terms of foreign policy. As I mentioned, now we getting support from various countries in the form of loans and in the form of infrastructure development, say roads and so on. But I would argue that what is better for us to ask is for them to again set up industries here, bases here. See, if it's a country that has a $1 trillion export market, at least give us 2-3 billion of your exports through Sri Lanka. Why don't you start your own industries here? I mean, that is way better.
But when you're starting your industries here, use our labor.
Correct, absolutely.
Don't bring labor from your country and do it here.
Absolutely.
Because that's been a big problem, because we see loans and financial facilities coming in, but at the same time they send their people as well. And most of the time, it's a part of their, I would say, conditions. If we have to give you this loan and start this project, we will have to use our people. And I like two other things you mentioned there, starting our own industries. Now, Ms. Singapore, since you mentioned about automobile, I'll take that as an example. From a pure economic sense, we see it's much cheaper right now to import a car rather than really assemble it here. But if we take that very myopic or short-term look and only keep looking at that, we will never have the sunshine industries or the upcoming industries developing. We need to take a bit of a maybe short-term hit and start something, because over a time, then more investments will come in. Then we will see the economies of scales coming in. So it takes a while, and I believe this is where the government also needs to support and say, look, if you're starting an automobile company, we understand you'll have a bit of extra cost. This is how we will support you. Don't you think that kind of a more long-term economic outlook is needed in our policy making?
Sure, I completely agree. Like I said, it should be a combination. We should get the technology from the latest technology, and then at the same time support the locals as well. Just supporting the locals may not achieve long-term success, because we
can't. Now it's 2021. We can't be making a car that was at the level of 1975.
Absolutely.
Using our only local technology.
Absolutely. So it's very important that we get the latest technology, and the best way is to ask these fellows to come and set up their operations here. There's already a market, let's say in the Toyotas and so on, and that will give you a start, and that will give a big boost to the local producers as well.
Understood. And even as you very correctly said, now the mindset of global economies is not really to do everything by yourself. We don't have time to be reinventing the wheel, because the market moves at such a fast pace.
That's right.
And as you very correctly said, a lot of companies are actually into this value-adding mode, which we will discuss later, where you bring the technology from outside that you may not have, you add in what you can add, and then you supply that to the global market. So rather than trying to build our own value chains, what you are suggesting is be a part of a global value chain. Am I right?
That's right. Absolutely right. And like I said, the foreign relations, these partnerships should be used to get into this supply chain, the global supply chain. See, the real thing that we want, I'm not saying that roads are not important, but let's say having an industry built up here is a lot more beneficial. See, if you put up a highway, of course, at the initial level of construction, some people might get jobs and some businesses might do well, but thereafter, it's only the traveler. It's not a clear benefit. Whereas if you put up an industry, a lot of people will get jobs, and Sri Lanka will develop or progress in the value chain, and that's a more long-lasting benefit. So that's why, again, I feel in terms of foreign policy, the focus should move to getting industries from these partners and our friendly countries in that angle, rather than just loans and setting up infrastructure, but to get into more like industries and get into the supply chains of which are already built by them.
Understood.
So that,
what are the key industries that we can rely on in order to propel the Sri Lankan economy to the post-pandemic new normal which the global economy will be facing? Stay tuned. We will discuss about that and more on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Our focus today is on the Sri Lankan economy, the challenges we face, and most importantly, the way forward. And we will discuss all the matters that you, as an entrepreneur, a business decision maker, or even a national level policy maker, needs to be aware of. And joining me for this very insightful discussion today is Mr. Varuna Singapuli. Mr. Varuna, let's talk about government policies. Now, the way I've seen it, when the global economy started expanding and we saw in the late 1970s Sri Lanka also becoming an open economy, playing a more crucial role in the global economy, we saw the apparel exports opportunity coming in and the tea exports taking place in a much more active manner, etc. But let's face the reality. In terms of the quality of the exports we send, with a few minor adjustments and enhancements from a few players, by and large, the perspective of the world about the Sri Lankan economy is that we are still sending most of the time low value added mass scale exports. This applies, I believe, for tea, for apparel, but now it's time to move on. Today we see the world operating more in terms of specializations. It's a one global supply chain, yes, but every country plays a more of a specialized role. In your opinion, what government policies do we need in order to move from low value added and low cost and low value added exports to a more specialist output economy? Your thoughts?
Yeah. So, like I said, the first thing is the foreign policy to get it right, and the second thing I would say is we badly need a revolution in terms of tertiary education.
Tertiary education.
Yeah. So that is what will really propel the economy, because see, all the industry that I talked about, technology, and even if we get the access to markets, even if we get the companies to come and invest here, the first thing they would ask is whether we have the labor force, and that is lacking in Sri Lanka. And the one thing that we have to do is to really have an investment drive led by the government in the tertiary education in terms of vocational training.
You're talking about after school, so once school is over.
Yes, in terms of vocational training, universities, colleges, so that we put out a labor force that is capable of supporting these industries. Because otherwise, like I said, even if you have access to markets, even if you get the technology companies to invest in Sri Lanka, the first thing they'll ask is, do you have the people? And the one reason why the big companies, the Toyotas, the Googles, and all these technology companies go to India and China is one main reason is that they have the labor force. Of course, we can never compete with India or China, but
Understood.
We can certainly have a lot more.
We can have our niche.
Yeah, we can have a lot more in the labor force, because say, even if you look at the IT services industry body called the SLASCOM, even they have said from the current level of about 6,000 graduate outputs for a year, we need to at least get to about 20,000. So there's a huge gap that needs to be fulfilled.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but our government university system per se is only able to accommodate about 10 to 15% of our total amount of students who do A-level.
Yeah,
and then we see a lot of students, even after O-level, they don't really continue, and even after A-level, so only when about 10% to 15% is accommodated, because we have about more than 200,000 students sitting for A-level, and our university system can accommodate about 20 to 30,000 maximum. So there is a problem. There's a lot of labor that goes west. Whoever can afford will definitely go and do private education, and the others might go abroad or something, or the others just fall off.
Sure. That's why you can't just leave it to the private sector and ask for private universities to come or whatever. It has to be driven by the government, and also not in the form of small type of entities. Of course, to some extent that can happen in terms of vocational training or whatever, but I strongly feel that we need a really world-class big university, say a technology university or whatever, where with a big capacity, a real world-class unit where we can bring in world-class talent, we can open up for foreign students and so on, so that we really make a statement as well that we are really getting into the global economy. So I think that's where, like I said, the government cannot say that we don't have money. Of course, the budget deficits are there, all those problems are there, but that is where
this is priority.
This is number one priority. That is what will drive. I mean, you ask the question why we are in this. I think that is one main reason. One is foreign policy,
education policy,
lack of drive in the tertiary education in terms of vocational training, in terms of university education, because knowledge is everything in this world.
It's a knowledge economy, isn't it?
It is a knowledge economy, and without knowledge, without we getting there, I mean, we have a lot of Sri Lankans doing very skilled jobs elsewhere in the world. I mean, even if you take US, if you take UK, we have...
And we saw recently the Queen's Honours List having so many Sri Lankans.
Absolutely, and scientists, and in the Sri Lankan economy, there's no place for them. So that's why there's a big gap that we have to match, and at the lower down level, the government has to come up with an investment drive over the next few years to make sure that we have that labor force in place, so that even if the foreign partners ask whether there is a labor force, we can readily answer, okay, it's been done, it will happen in the coming years. And like I said, the government can't pass it to the private sector. It can happen to the private sector as well, but there has to be a big drive from the government.
The drive has to come from the government or the public sector.
Absolutely.
And I also want to touch on this very controversial topic of medical education, healthcare education. Now, we all know about the rush for medical colleges in Sri Lanka. And Singapore, we all know, local A-levels being one of the toughest exams in the world, I believe, in my personal opinion. There are people who get 3 A's and who still can't go to the university. Now, most of these students have to go abroad, spending millions of dollars of Sri Lankan money. And why? To get that education. On the other hand, in my view, if there were better, of course, with the right regulations, with the right property, I would say with the right proper quality controls, if we had better medical education facilities, maybe from the private sector in Sri Lanka, I'm thinking, in my view, correct me if I'm wrong, not only for the Sri Lankan economy, but we could be actually producing more healthcare workers, doctors and other associated healthcare workers to the whole world. And India is doing this right now. They are preparing a global workforce of healthcare workers. Isn't this a missed opportunity?
Now, I think there are two ways to look at this. One, I would say, is see the doctors who are mostly in the government sector. So their true potential is not really exploited, I feel. One thing is, the so-called medical tourism that we have talked about. I think we need to get the medical profession into making a real forex earner, because like you said, we have a lot of talent here, but we are not really using it. They are somewhat becoming a burden to the government because they are just getting the taxpayers' money in the form of government salaries. But if you can really bring in the tourists as a medical tourism initiative where these doctors are utilized to earn foreign exchange, then you are really making use of this big group of people.
And we have the potential, isn't it? Because we see in countries like Maldives, Seychelles, there's a very high regard for Sri Lankan doctors and Sri Lankan healthcare system.
So I certainly believe there should be a change in terms of retaining some of these doctors who are leaving the country as well. And that would be a very good business model. Where you bring in tourists for medical purposes, and do you really utilize these medical professionals. And the other element I would say is, like you said, everybody rushes to do medicine because you have the security of a job. So that mentality is what is driving this, which is a bit of a shame, because like I said, the brightest group of people arguably in the country are really not making a contribution in terms of foreign exchange earnings. So there is a little bit of a mismatch in that sense as well.
Interesting. Now, in your book, A Simple Plan for the Sri Lankan Economy, and I really like how you have simplified things in that, Varuna. It's a great publication. Well done to you on that.
Thank you.
You talk about the stop T model of the economy, and that's where I really stopped glancing through the book and I really stopped and went into the details. Tell us about the stop T model, a set of industries which you think has tremendous potential to empower the Sri Lankan economy, especially in a new normal in this post-pandemic global economic world. Tell us about the stop T model.
So the stop T stands for 4 sectors: SMEs, tourism, and then the technology and port related. So if I may start with tourism, that is really the low-hanging fruit for Sri Lanka. So if you take the last 10 years, it's the tourism sector that has really grown the fastest. So if you take 2009, we made about $400 million of earnings, which went up past $4 billion by 2018. So it was a phenomenal growth.
About $4.4 billion.
Correct. So if things go the way it should go, we should, from the third highest foreign exchange earner, tourism should become the first or the highest foreign exchange earner over the next 5 to 10 years.
And do you still see that potential even in a post-pandemic world? Still people are a little reluctant to travel. As we speak, they have just opened up the airport. But do you still believe in the potential of the tourism industry?
Absolutely. I think pandemic will probably last for another year or 2 or maximum 3, let's say. I mean, these are things that have happened, like I said, once in a generation event, but it's not a forever thing event. So after that, the tourism will pick, and hopefully Sri Lanka will be in a position where we can really exploit. So like I said, clearly we should be able to get to $10 billion over the next 5 to 10 years. years. So the good thing about tourism is that it really trickles down to a lot of people, to a big proportion of the population, because in terms of homestays, you have these little restaurants if you go down south. So it really trickles down. So that's why
even the little shop selling hoppers makes money.
Absolutely. So that really trickles down. That's why it's such a great industry and really the low-hanging fruit, because see, Sri Lanka is a beautiful country, small country, so that you can access from one point to the other very quickly. So there are some good factors that are in place for Sri Lanka. But what I wanted to emphasize was, I mean, most times you see of these marketing campaigns, that's where the money is spent and focus is. But what I feel is, in terms of tourism, we should focus more on the product, in terms of making the attractions more attractive, in the form of making these attractions more unique, by focusing on cleanliness, by focusing on security. So we have to really focus on the product. I mean, you have examples in Singapore and all these places. If you focus on the product and develop it further, I think there's huge potential, because what I believe is, this day and age, I mean, with social media, word of mouth is very powerful, and references or recommendations from a first-hand user is a lot more powerful than all these campaigns. So that's why I feel one thing that we have to do is to really focus on the product a little bit more, and then I think this 10 billion could be easily 20 billion over the next 15 odd years. So that's one segment. And then moving on to the technology sector, the second one, like I explained earlier, one thing is the foreign policy, and then getting the market access with all this, and the drive on the education front. We have to really see a difference in the technology sphere, because if you take the last 3, 4, 5 decades, every country that developed was through the technology boom, and that's where we have to be in it. We can't be just a tourism economy like Maldives. We have a lot more potential than that. So that's why tourism is the technology sector is very important as well. Moving on, I would say SME is the other critical aspect, because
more than 50% of our economic contribution.
Yeah, because that's where the people are. If you take, a lot of people are self-employed, they have these small enterprises, so these people need a boost, and actually tourism itself is a real boost for SMEs. Like you said, even the one who's selling hoppers will benefit. So tourism will have a trickle-down impact on the SMEs. Technology will have a trickle-down impact on SMEs, because if you have big companies coming in, there'll be obviously demand for food, demand for hoppers, demand for clothes, and so on. So there'll be these supporting little industries, and even providing technological equipments, because if you take Taiwan, it's a story of SMEs. They built around SMEs, and so here as well, if you can have these SMEs developing little pieces, equipments for these big companies, that itself will be a real boost. So in terms of SMEs, what I would say is, the government has to provide relief in terms of soft loans and in terms of tax concessions and things like that, so that you really give a boost to the SME side as well. And finally, I would say is the port-related industries.
There's a lot of renewed interest towards this as well, isn't it?
Because Sri Lanka is strategically placed, as everybody says, from the Europe to the Asia, we are rightly in the middle. So in terms of bunkering, in terms of shipbuilding, in terms of transshipment, container handling, we are both the Colombo and the Hambantota port has a lot of potential. Like you said, we need to be patient, but at the same time, we have to be doing the right things, calling the right people, getting the right partners in, and so on. So,
and most importantly, making the right investment decision.
Correct, absolutely. But there is a lot of potential in that sector as well. So that's why I said these are the 4 key sectors that could really drive Sri Lanka out of this lower middle income trap towards a higher income status.
And if we could quickly touch upon the fiscal policies followed by a lot of governments. Now, we've seen successive governments have really ruled over a very large deficit, or I would say a debt that we are facing. About 87% of our GDP is debt actually. So that means whatever 100 rupees we earn, about 87 of it has to be used to pay back the debt, which is which has been ongoing on a rolling basis. Now, in your view, what are the, I would say, the errors that we have made in our fiscal policies over the last few years?
Yeah. So like I said, for us to really drive these strategies that we talked about in terms of foreign policy, especially in terms of educational drive, and to encourage these SMEs and the tourism, if the fiscal deficit expands by doing those, it's fine. That's what I feel. You can't be doing too many things, okay? Because you have to prioritize. Priority number 1, in my view, is to drive these industries and get into that plan. So fiscal deficit is secondary in my view. So in doing that, if you expand the fiscal policy, it's still fine. But what has actually happened over the past is we have expanded the fiscal policy, but not by doing those things, by giving goodies, by giving misdirected tax concessions and things, expenditure on unnecessary things. So if the fiscal deficit expands for those things, then obviously it's a problem.
Correct.
So,
And also
that's
we
what
see
we
the
should
deficit expanding, but then some of the new loans that are coming in are basically being used to settle some of the previous loans.
Correct.
And over a time, people will be like, any investor, any lender will be like, no, you don't have a clear plan for this borrowing, so why should we lend it out to you?
So that's where we have got into right now. And at the same time, I want to mention at a certain point, there was also the thinking of fiscal consolidation, bringing down this deficit and by increasing taxes. And that also I completely disagree, but because simply by increasing taxes, you are not going to help anything, because the moment that happens, all the businesses start struggling, they are not making money, and then in fact, effectively, you are getting less tax income. So actually, it didn't help to reduce the budget deficit, and that itself was not a good plan at all, because you can't be short-term oriented in that. You should have a much better plan, and the critical is to prioritize. You have to know what to tackle first, because in 5 years there's only a little limited amount that you can achieve. You can't achieve what you can achieve over 30-40 years in 5 years. So that's why you need to prioritize, and that's why you need to focus on those aspects that I mentioned.
What actions do state-owned enterprises need to take to turn them around and make them more valuable contributors towards the success of our economy? Let's discuss that on the other side of this break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. The way forward for the Sri Lankan economy, something that so many entrepreneurs, so many business decision makers, and anyone who is interested to see the future direction of this country will be paying close attention to. Hence, that has been our focus today on Bisnomics. And joining me for this very insightful discussion is Mr. Waruna Singapuli. Waruna, now before the break, we had a chat about some of the errors we have been doing in our fiscal policy. But there is nothing called too much emphasis on this problem, because I believe that this has been one of the biggest issues we have been facing. Let's face it, since the late 1970s and 80s, we haven't had a proper I would say a surplus, isn't it? We've been quite, I would say, overly debt loaded, and sometimes we've borrowed it for strategic reasons and we have had wrong implementations, and sometimes we have just borrowed it for the sake of cheap credit being available, and we know that that has led to even some of our assets having to be given to foreign nations. I mean, this is the very, I would say, dire truth and that we are facing as a country and citizens of this nation. But in your view, how dire is this debt trap that we have truly fallen into? Because the way I see it, we keep on borrowing just to pay back so many other different foreign bodies and entities. I mean, let's say it openly. We see IMF dictating a huge part of our fiscal policy, and that's natural because they have obviously given a large part of the debt and we have to pay that back. Do we need to, don't we need to have a plan beyond just borrowing and paying back previous debtors? Don't we need previous creditors, don't we need the proper plan where we borrow and this is where we will invest, we'll get the money from that and we'll pay you, until then give us time, be patient. Should that not be our policy? Yeah,
absolutely. I think I totally agree that the plan is at least not visible. So here what I would want to say is there are two aspects to it. One is the rupee loans and then the other is the foreign loans. So some tend to think that, okay, the cause of this problem is the fact that government is spending more money and the fiscal deficit and so on. But I tend to disagree with that. Like I said at the very beginning, the bigger problem for me is that since 1978, we have been buying more things from the world than selling to them. So that's why there's a big trade deficit, which has been financed through foreign borrowings. That's why the foreign borrowings have really gone up. And that is what is really unsustainable right now, the risk of sovereign default and things like that. See, in terms of rupee debt, at least the central bank can service it. They can print money, and I know it's not the ideal solution, but at least
fundamentally
it's
possible.
Doable. It's doable. Whereas foreign loans, you just can't. If you don't have dollars, you simply can't pay.
And most of our debt is in foreign money, isn't it?
It's getting close to 50%, and at the rate the rupee is depreciating, it can be even higher. So that's why I say this addressing the current account deficit problem is number one. It's actually the factor that would help us to solve the debt problem as well. Because see, if we can wipe out this current account deficit over the, let's say, next 5 years or 6 years or whatever, this $2-3 billion foreign deficit problem is wiped out, then we don't have to borrow foreign money. So then it's very clear to the foreign borrowers and everybody else that, okay, they have a plan. So like I said, without trying to solve every problem these 5-6 years, if we can get into a path of high growth, 6-7% growth, and wipe out this current account deficit in a sustainable manner, that itself is a great achievement. I mean, I wouldn't really mind where the fiscal deficit is. Even if it goes up, you can still continue to service it. So that's why I feel that should be the real long-term solution to address the debt problem, rather than just talking or making ad hoc efforts in terms of fiscal policy and so on. That would really help us to come out of that problem.
And Varun, I mean, if you look at some of the developed economies like the US or even countries like Japan, they have a much bigger fiscal debt as a percentage of their GDP than us. But their economies have a plan, isn't it? Now, let's also talk about some of the real examples of countries. Now, in your book, you have suggested so many strategies that could be taken. And I believe you take a very long-term approach, which any economy needs. What are the global economic success stories that we could share where a proper long-term economic direction combined with proper political vision and mindset as well has led to successful, what we call, gold medal economic nations being created?
So if you take Japan, if you take South Korea, if you take Taiwan, all these countries that developed over the last 30-40 years, they took a similar approach because they were very pragmatic in terms of their foreign policy. They got into these Western markets, they made inroads to foreign markets through the foreign policy. Of course, they have to make certain probably costs in that terms, but they got into those markets, and then later on at this point in time probably they don't need it anymore because they made the access through such strategies that we talked about. And especially in the case of South Korea, for instance, they got the technology from Japan, and then they ended up selling it to automobiles to the Western markets. So if you take Japan in terms of automobiles, if you take Taiwan in terms of semiconductors, if you take South Korea in terms of automobiles and smartphones, it's the same sort of strategy that we discussed about that they implemented through pragmatic ways as well. And moving on to the fiscal deficit story, if you take, say, private tech sector examples like the Facebooks and the Amazons and the FedEx and things like that, in the initial years, these companies were making losses. But what they did was they were growing very fast. So when they were growing very fast, what they did was they were capturing market share and made competition irrelevant. So once they reached a certain point, then they could turn around.
Market.
They had a captive market and they could turn the financials around. So that's the same thing for Sri Lanka as well. I mean, if we worry about fiscal deficit and don't really do those strategies that we discussed about and get those investors in, we will miss this growth phase as well. I mean, there's Vietnam, there's India, there's Thailand, and all these countries, Bangladesh, all these countries will again attract these investors.
And we see Bangladesh has actually pulled out so many people out of poverty. It's today, for if you consider the last 2 decades, it's an economic success story.
So all of them will start attracting these big investors in terms of automobiles, electronics and so on, and we will miss that ride if we are not focused in getting those into Sri Lanka. So that's why what I feel is, see, our mentality is still very debt driven, or bankers mentality, I would say, because we look at having a beautiful balance sheet. That's why we talk about fiscal deficit, because we want to get the lenders in. But what we should really look for is the equity investors, the FDIs, the real investors. They are less worried. I'm not saying they are not worried about fiscal deficit, but they're less worried about it. But what they're more interested in is the plan and the growth story. If there's high growth, if there's a solid plan, they will come in, and they are the ones that we really need, not the lenders. What we need are the investors, and that's why we have to get out of the lending or the debtors or the bankers mentality and get to the investors mentality and do our strategies based on that.
You mentioned about South Korea. Now, Ruchir Sharma, I think he's the author of the book Breakthrough Nations or Breakout Nations, and he very nicely mentions South Korea as actually what we call a gold medal economy, because not only did the country grow as an economy, but it had almost at a very equal level economic growth. They made sure that the entire country, to a maximum possible amount, of course not everyone, but the amount of people who came out of poverty, that I would say the level of income and the economic growth distribution was marvelous, because so many people benefited from that. Isn't that the focus that we need as well, where not just a few parties growing, not just a few people or a few entities growing, where we have a much more sustainable and a much more I would say, widespread, rampant economic growth throughout the country in all sectors. Don't you think that that is what we need?
Absolutely, and I think even Taiwan is a good case study as well in that sense. So that's why we emphasize on the SMEs, that's why we emphasize on the tourism and even technology, because see, rather than putting up a road where the benefit will be only for few and maybe on a short-term basis, industries, building up industries which are long-term things are very much more desirable.
Understood. Varuna, the very crucial topic of state-owned enterprises. I think day in, day out, most of the time what we hear is bad news. We hear about the, I would say, gigantic losses we are making. We hear about the corruption, the constant management shuffles, lack of a proper direction. And we hear about this from airlines to the other public transport to utility providers. How badly have we messed up our state-owned enterprises sector? Let's be brutally honest here.
Yeah. So if you take the SOEs, I think there are three main entities: the CEB, Ceylon Electricity Board, and then you have the CPC, Ceylon Petroleum Corporation, and then you have the Sri Lankan Airlines. So these are the three players that are really contributing to these losses. So if you take CEB, the Electricity Board, if you take the data for the last 10-20 years, it's very clear whenever there's high rainfall, CEB makes money, they are profitable. So
they are making a profit at times.
Yeah, because those are the times when the low cost hydropower plants are better utilized. So one exception is 2015 when the Norechole coal power plant came in. Even with the dry weather, the CEB still made some money. So to me, it's more of implementation problem. See, the CEB comes up with this long-term energy generation plan, but then you have seen years where you do not implement it. These large-scale power plants do not come in, and then you have to go for these immediate or urgent requirements in terms of very high-cost thermal plants or the diesel plants. So it is a case of implementation predominantly in my view. If you go for these low-cost fuel plants methodically, it can be, those losses can be brought down in a big way.
Correct. But isn't that a catch-22 by itself? Because yes, coal power plants are cheaper. Even today, it's one of the cheapest sources of energy. But at the same time, here comes the environmental concerns, the sustainability issues. What do you say to that?
Sure, that trade-off should be factored into. I mean, but at the same time, I think we have to take a practical view as well, as to where we stand in terms of the environmental damage. See, if you take, say, the last 10-20 years, this argument came in. China was also being shown as somebody who is not playing well. So we have to see the economic and the environmental impact. So it's a trade-off, and say if we are $20,000 economy, the way we look at environment, and when we are a $4,000 economy, when we look at the environment, it should be different. It's my personal view. Could be a controversial view as well. But see, if Sri Lankans are leaving the country to other countries because the prospects are not so great here, should environment concerns be as equally bad as the economic concerns? So it's a trade-off for people to...
And as you very correctly said, we saw China initially, they didn't care what the world was saying about the environment.
That's how they caught up.
They caught up. But today, having caught up, having grown, today they are the biggest investor in green energy. See, we should know when to do what. Like I said, prioritizing. We should know what to prioritize now and what to prioritize 10-20 years later. So CEB, having said that, like you said, I think CEB also, if there are management issues, if there are wastage, certainly those things have to be rectified. Yes.
But having said that, say if you move on to Petroleum Corporation, if the moment the Electricity Board is financially stable, that's a huge benefit to the Petroleum Corporation, because a big problem for the Petroleum Corporation is the dues from the CEB. So the moment CEB is doing okay, CPC will also naturally will be doing all right. But on top of all this, what I would say is both electricity and fuel are key ingredients or key raw materials for the economy. See, if you take the businesses, if you take the factories, if you take the households, these are key items. So what we should look at is in the form of providing reliable services at a competitive price. See, more than the profitability of these entities. See, what is the point of CEB making a profit if we give unreliable electricity and high cost electricity to the consumers? Then we are as a nation uncompetitive in the global economy. So we have to know,
and the investors won't come in. And we saw how in countries like Pakistan, we saw a large part of the apparel sector investments drying up simply because the power sector was the power provision and the power generation was unreliable.
Absolutely. So that's why we shouldn't miss the big picture. You know, some of these arguments could be political in nature in finding SOEs as a fault, but we have to see the big picture what their role is. Same thing with CPC as well. See if crude oil price goes up beyond $100 or $110, I don't see why CPC should be making money. They have to absorb the loss and make sure the economy is shielded to an extent. You know, you can't pass on that shock to the consumers, to the businesses, and so on, because then if you wipe out some of these businesses in the process, then they may never come back. So that's why I didn't agree with this daily changing pricing formula. It should be more a long-term pricing formula. Correct. Where certainly when the crude oil comes down to 30, 40, 50, CPC should be making money. No excuses there.
True.
But when it goes beyond 100, it shouldn't be the case. So it should be more long-term pricing formula, because see, these commodity prices are cyclical. If you take the last 50 years, it's very cyclical. There are ups and downs. So you have to know where to price and exactly at what point.
And a final note on Sri Lankan Airlines.
Correct. Yeah. So moving on to Sri Lankan Airlines, the same psychology that we should have. See, what is the role of Sri Lankan Airlines? Again, if there are management issues, wastage, you have to address it. But you have to see what is the role of Sri Lankan Airlines in the tourism industry. See, Sri Lankan Airlines is the main carrier that brings in tourists to Sri Lanka. See, so if you try to let's say Colombo to London, that flight only Sri Lankan does. See, if that flight is only 50% utilized, Sri Lankan might be making a loss with each flight.
But the people who come in,
but the people who come here, if they spend a lot, that is distributed among a wider variety of people. See,
so we need a more holistic view or an integrated view.
Absolutely. See, if Sri Lankan Airlines makes a loss of 10 million, but in the process gives a $2 billion rupee income to the tourism industry.
Yes.
Should we just save this 10 million at the expense of shutting down this 2 billion? So that's why we need more data. I'm not saying that's happening, but we need more data. I think Sri Lankan Airlines and the tourism industry can get together and do this study and see where exactly it is. And to that extent, helping CPC or CEB and Sri Lankan Airlines, you know, some support from the treasury will be an indirect stimulus for the economy, to the tourism industry, to the broader set of factories and industries and so on. So that's the way to look at the SOEs in my view, rather than just looking at one entity and saying, okay, they made a 100 million loss this year. It's a much broader than that.
Understood. The multifaceted, dynamic Sri Lankan economy, a topic that we could go on for days, weeks and months, analyzing, discussing, strategizing what should we do next. And in the last 60 minutes, we have focused on a very quick overview of where the Sri Lankan economy is, what is the way forward from here, and especially as the global economy enters a post-pandemic new normal, what are the key industries that we could focus on in order to make sure that we strengthen the journey of our economy, so that the citizens of this country, you and I, and our future generations can participate and make their lives, our lives, and also the country a success story in the global business world. Varuna, thank you very much for sharing your insights. You really brought all the different dimensions. You explained it in a very simple way, so that I believe from a layman to an economic specialist will understand, and we wish you good luck with your future activities and future work and journey in the corporate world as well.
Thank you, Dari.
And with that, we wrap up today's episode of Bisnomics. This is where we discuss the latest in the Sri Lankan business and economic landscape. We will meet you with the next episode. I am Tarun Amarasekar.